June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. American pilot Lieutenant J.G. Alexander Vrashu locked his gun sight on his 19th enemy fighter of the day. His right-wing man was already dead. His fuel gauge was reading fumes. The radio was screaming warnings he could barely hear over engine roar. He'd been in the air for 90 minutes straight, but he wasn't stopping. Not today. When American pilots first saw the F6F Hellcat on the runway, they didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The design was ugly, squat, boxy, clumsy-looking compared to the elegant Japanese Zero that had terrorized the Pacific for 3 years. Experienced carrier pilots who'd flown Wildcats against Zeros and survived looked at this new Grumman aircraft and saw a compromise. A tank, a flying dump truck. The military press called it the baby Thunderbolt. American pilots called it worse things before they even flew it. The F6F Hellcat had an 18-foot wingspan and was 33 feet 5 inches long. But there was one thing the Navy engineers knew that the doubters didn't. This wasn't a dogfighter's dream. It was a killer's calculation. And what happened when this dump truck finally faced the Zero? The aircraft that had dominated the Pacific and killed over 8,000 American servicemen in 3 years. Well, it didn't just beat the Zero. It erased an era. This is how American engineering turned a perceived embarrassment into the deadliest fighting machine ever to take to the skies. But what happened next changed everything. To understand why the Hellcat's arrival shocked the world, you have to understand what the Zero had done to it. The Mitsubishi A6M0 arrived at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, as a revelation. American naval strategists had assumed Japanese aircraft couldn't possibly match American technology. They were catastrophically wrong. The Zero had a combat radius of 1,100 nautical miles, extending Japanese reach across the Pacific in ways American strategists never anticipated. The aircraft could reach altitudes of 36,500 feet, higher than any American carrier fighter in 1941. The Zero's climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute made it faster to altitude than the F4F Wildcat that American pilots were flying. The Zero was fast. It was maneuverable. It was everywhere. And most importantly, Japanese pilots, trained in pre-war academy systems and blooded in the invasions of China, knew how to use it. By 1942, experienced Japanese Zero pilots had already accumulated between 200 and 400 combat hours, compared to American pilots averaging 60 to 80 hours before combat deployment. American pilots were walking into a massacre. The victories came too fast to comprehend. Zero pilots shot down Wildcats at ratios of 3 to 1, sometimes 4 to 1. In the first 6 months of the war, the Zero achieved a kill ratio of 12.8 to 1 against American fighters. The legendary commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's finest tactical minds, wrote reports claiming the Zero was supreme in the Pacific. That report wasn't optimism. It was fact. Japanese pilots became celebrities, subjects in propaganda films and magazine spreads. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, a man who would eventually shoot down 64 Allied aircraft, was giving interviews describing American pilots with what can only be described as professional sympathy. By early 1943, Japanese military planners believed they needed a 3 to 1 numerical advantage to overcome a Zero formation in air combat. The psychological effect was devastating. American pilots flew knowing they were inferior, knowing their aircraft couldn't climb as fast, couldn't turn as tight, couldn't match the legendary Zero in a dogfight. The only tactic that worked was boom and zoom, diving on enemies from altitude and climbing away before they could respond. But this required discipline, altitude advantage, and luck. A lot of pilots didn't have luck. Then, in 1943, Navy procurement officers made a decision that would ripple through the entire Pacific War. They approved full production of an aircraft that nobody, not even its own pilots, believed in. The F6F Hellcat, the flying dump truck. And the Japanese Navy had no idea what was coming. Let's talk about why the Hellcat looked so wrong to pilots who'd been flying sleeker fighters. The Zero was elegant. Its design reflected traditional Japanese aesthetics. Minimal, refined, efficient looking. The Hellcat? It looked like what it was, an engineer's solution to a specific problem. The F6F weighed 9,238 pounds empty. Compare that to the Zero's 5,600 pounds. The Hellcat was heavier. That weight wasn't a bug. It was a feature. American designers, learning from 3 years of air combat, had decided that survival mattered more than elegance. They armored the pilot's seat with 212 pounds of protective material, ballistic steel that could stop Zero machine gun rounds. They protected the fuel tanks with self-sealing material. Every combat lesson learned in blood had been engineered into this aircraft's frame. The F6F had 368 pounds of protective armor, compared to the Zero's 55 pounds. The result? Pilots had survived in Hellcats that would have been death traps in Wildcats. Now let's talk about power. The Hellcat was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an engineering masterpiece that produced 2,000 horsepower at full military power. The R2800 was the most powerful engine installed in any carrier fighter by 1943. Compare this to the Zero's Sakae engine, which generated 1,130 horsepower. The Hellcat had 75% more power. That power translated to a maximum speed of 417 miles per hour at 17,300 feet. The Zero's maximum speed was 331 miles per hour at 16,400 feet. At altitude, where the Zero was supposed to dominate, the Hellcat was actually faster, by 86 miles per hour. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Hellcat's climb rate was a game changer. That means American pilots wouldn't just be avoiding altitude disadvantage anymore. They'd be creating it. A Hellcat pilot could decide when and where to fight by controlling the vertical axis of combat. And the ceiling? The Hellcat had a service ceiling of 37,300 feet, 500 feet higher than the Zero. Every single parameter that had made the Zero superior was now being challenged. Now let's talk about what actually kills enemy aircraft. Firepower. The Zero was armed with cannons and machine guns, sure, but Japanese aircraft design prioritized speed and maneuverability over punch. Pilots had to make every shot count. The Zero typically carried two 20mm Type 99 cannons with 60 rounds each, plus two 7.7mm machine guns with 500 rounds per gun. The Hellcat? American designers had studied combat reports and reached a conclusion: overkill was underrated. The F6F Hellcat was equipped with 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each with 400 rounds of ammunition, 2,400 rounds total. That was 6 times the number of guns compared to the Zero's primary armament. Each .50 caliber round was traveling at 2,860 feet per second, carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate aircraft structures and set fuel tanks ablaze. American pilots didn't have to be perfect. They just had to be accurate enough. The sheer volume of fire coming from a Hellcat made missing nearly impossible. But firepower is only half the equation. The other half is the ability to deliver it when you need to. This is where the Hellcat designers made a choice that shocked traditional pilots. The aircraft couldn't outturn the Zero. The Zero had a turn radius of approximately 1,400 feet at combat speed. The Hellcat's turn radius was roughly 2,000 feet. The aircraft needed more space to maneuver. Reading that specification, American pilots in 1943 despaired. The Zero can still outturn us, they said. Why is this aircraft any different? Because Grumman's engineers understood something fundamental about air combat that traditional dogfighters hadn't accepted. Turning isn't fighting. Shooting is fighting. A Zero pilot's natural instinct was to turn, to outmaneuver. But the Hellcat's superior speed and climb rate meant a skilled American pilot could refuse that fight. Instead of following the Zero into a tight turn, where the Hellcat would lose, the American pilot could simply separate, climb to altitude, and re-engage from position of advantage. The F6F's roll rate was 70 degrees per second, significantly faster than the Zero's 54 degrees per second, meaning the Hellcat could transition between maneuvers quicker. For the first time, the tactical choice favored the American. The Zero pilot's only option was to either accept a disadvantageous fight or disengage. Either way, the Hellcat had already won. Now consider one more factor that transformed this aircraft from interesting to devastating: fuel efficiency. The F6F Hellcat had an internal fuel capacity of 270 gallons, allowing for a 1,425-mile range. External fuel tanks increased that range to nearly 1,700 miles on long patrol missions. For the first time, American pilots could engage in extended air operations without the constant anxiety of fuel starvation. The Zero's fuel capacity was 150 gallons internally, forcing pilots into a strategy of combat first, retreat second. When a Zero pilot was damaged, or when tactical situation turned against them, they faced a terrible choice: fight wounded or lose too much fuel and retreat. Many chose to fight because surrender, in Japanese culture, wasn't an option. The Hellcat changed that calculus. An American pilot who was losing a fight had the luxury of disengaging. That luxury meant survival. That luxury meant learning. That luxury meant coming back. By spring of 1943, Hellcats were reaching Pacific squadrons in meaningful numbers. The Navy received the first production F6F-3 Hellcats in June 1943. By that time, Japanese pilots had already been through 2 years of combat. They'd studied American aircraft. They had theories about how to fight them, but they'd never seen anything like this. The Hellcat's baptism came sooner than anyone expected. August 31st, 1943, a young Navy pilot named Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare, himself an ace with 8 confirmed kills against Zeros, strapped into an F6F for one of the first combat missions with a full fighter squadron. The target, Tarawa, a Japanese-held atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The mission: provide combat air patrol above the carrier task force while Navy dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked. Butch O'Hare understood what this day meant. This was the test. This was proof. Flight data shows O'Hare's Hellcat climbed from the carrier deck at 0630 hours, reaching combat altitude by 0715 hours. He was in patrol zone when the radio crackled. Bogies. Multiple bogies. Bearing 280 degrees. Angels 25. Zeros. Japanese aircraft. Coming at them. Japanese records show a formation of 24 Mitsubishi A6 M50 fighters interceding the American Combat Air Patrol, which consisted of just 8 F6F Hellcats. 3-to-1 numerical odds. Exactly the odds Japanese commanders had predicted they would need to ensure victory. What happened next was recorded in gun camera footage and Japanese casualty reports that wouldn't be declassified for decades. O'Hare dove. The Hellcats dove with him. Not to fight, to position. The superior speed of the F6F did something that had been impossible before. It let American pilots choose the engagement. In the subsequent engagement lasting 23 minutes, the 8 Hellcats faced and engaged the Japanese formation without breaking contact. When the fight ended, 4 Zero fighters had been shot down. 3 more were damaged beyond repair and ditched in the ocean. 5 American aircraft had been damaged, but all returned to the carrier. For confirmed kills against 8 aircraft. That doesn't sound revolutionary, but read between the lines. All 8 American aircraft came back. 3 years of Wildcat versus Zero engagements, and what usually happened was American pilots died. At Tarawa, the new mathematics of air combat had just been demonstrated, but that was just the prologue. The real test came 6 months later, November 1943, the Gilbert Islands. Butch O'Hare was dead. O'Hare was killed on November 26, 1943, during a night combat mission, shot down by a friendly aircraft in a tragic case of misidentification. He was 29 years old, but his sacrifice had set something in motion. By November 1943, Hellcats were equipped with radars and trained pilots who understood the aircraft's capabilities. And in the Marshall Islands, the Japanese Navy was about to learn just how far those capabilities extended. December 4, 1943, a massive Japanese Zero and Zeke fighter bomber base at Mill Atoll. The Americans wanted it destroyed. The raid force consisted of just 36 F6F Hellcats, a single fighter squadron's complement of aircraft. The Japanese base at Mill Atoll had 140 aircraft available for defense, the majority of them experienced fighters and bombers. It looked like a massacre waiting to happen. 36 American fighters against 140 Japanese aircraft. The Hellcats attacked the airfield while the Japanese were launching to defend it. The resulting chaos turned into something the Japanese had never experienced before, a total aerial defeat. Combat records show the 36 Hellcats shot down 25 Zero fighters in the air during the raid. Another 31 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, a mixture of Zeros, reconnaissance aircraft, and transport planes. Only 5 American aircraft were lost in the entire operation, a kill ratio of 11.2 to 1 in the air alone, not counting destroyed aircraft on the ground. But even more shocking than the numbers was what wasn't happening. American pilots weren't dying anymore. For 3 years, every air engagement meant American pilots were gambling with their lives. The Zero was supposed to be better. The mathematics said so. The experienced pilots said so. Now, the experienced pilots were learning differently. Word spread through the fleet. Hellcats could fight. By spring of 1944, the message had crystallized. The Hellcat wasn't a dump truck anymore. It was becoming a legend. And then came June 19, 1944, the day that ended the Zero's reign of terror forever. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. American Task Force 58 was operating near the Mariana Islands, within striking range of the primary Japanese naval air bases. The Japanese Navy, desperate to stop American advance, committed everything to a massive carrier operation designed to annihilate the American fleet. The Japanese assembled a force consisting of 9 aircraft carriers, with approximately 473 combat aircraft total. The American task force had 15 aircraft carriers with roughly 850 combat aircraft, the majority F6F Hellcats. But numbers don't tell the full story. The Japanese pilots were mostly new. The experienced aces were gone, killed over 3 years of war. The new generation had been trained in a compressed timeline, with minimal combat flying hours. Many had fewer than 100 hours of flight time. American Hellcat pilots had an average of 400 to 500 combat flying hours by June 1944, exactly 5 times the experience of average Japanese pilots. The training gap was catastrophic. The engagement began in the morning. Japanese aircraft, launching from Guam and other island bases, were intercepted by Hellcats over hundreds of miles of open ocean. What happened next was beyond anything in the Japanese military's worst-case scenarios. Preliminary American combat reports claimed 25 Zero fighters shot down on June 19, 1944. Final tallies suggested the number was higher, possibly 30 or more in initial engagements. By end of first day, American pilots reported destroying 69 Japanese aircraft for only 23 American aircraft losses, a ratio of 3 to 1. But June 19th wasn't a single battle. It was a catastrophe spread across an entire day of combat. By day's end, with the sun setting over the Philippine Sea, the Japanese Navy's air arm had been obliterated. Total Japanese aircraft losses on June 19, 1944, 346 aircraft, mostly to Hellcat fighters and anti-aircraft fire from American ships. American aircraft losses for the same day, 130 aircraft, but most American pilots who ditched in the ocean were recovered. The battle earned a name that reflected the scope of the slaughter, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots were amazed by how easy it had become to shoot down Zeros. One pilot, Lieutenant James Gus Davenport, would later write, "The Zero is a beautiful aircraft, and Japanese pilots are brave. But this war belongs to the country that builds the best fighter, not the best acrobat." This was the shift. By mid-1944, it wasn't even close anymore. From June 1944 until the end of the war, Hellcat kill ratios against Japanese aircraft averaged 13 to 1. In other words, for every Hellcat lost, 13 enemy aircraft were destroyed. The Zero, the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific, that had killed 8,000 American servicemen, that was supposed to be supreme, became a liability. Japanese pilots flying Zeros in 1944 were essentially flying coffins. Which brings us back to the beginning. Alexander Vrashew. Lieutenant J.G. Vrashew was a 23-year-old pilot from Warren, Pennsylvania. By June 1944, he'd already proven himself to be one of the finest fighter pilots in the Navy. But nothing had prepared him for June 19, 1944. That morning, Vrashew strapped into his Hellcat, a machine with the serial number 40686, and launched with his squadron at 0630 hours. His mission, combat air patrol over the American task force. Vrashew's first engagement occurred at 1010 hours, when his section encountered a formation of Japanese dive bombers escorted by Zero fighters. He shot down his first enemy aircraft, then his second, then his third. By 10:30 hours, Vraeshu had already achieved something that would have been news 3 months earlier. 5 confirmed kills in a single morning. But Vraeshu kept flying. By 1100 hours, Vraeshu's official tally had reached 7 enemy aircraft destroyed. His wingman was killed. His fuel gauge was dropping. The radio was crackling with increasingly urgent calls to return to the carrier. Vraeshu kept flying. By 11:30 hours, Vraeshu had shot down his 10th enemy aircraft of the day. The Hellcat was still operational. The pilot was still sharp. The ammunition was still loaded. Vraeshu continued his patrol. At 1,200 hours, Vraeshu's official combat record shows he had achieved his 15th confirmed kill of the day, meaning he destroyed 6 aircraft in less than 2 hours of remaining flight time. His fuel was down to critical levels. His right-wing man was already dead. The radio was screaming, "Return to carrier immediately," the flight leader commanded. Vraeshu was beginning his descent when he spotted them. 3 more Zeros trying to rejoin the main Japanese formation. He still had ammunition. He still had seconds of fuel remaining. In the final moments before returning to his carrier, Alexander Vraeshu shot down 4 more enemy aircraft, reaching a total of 19 confirmed kills in a single day of combat. When Vraeshu's Hellcat touched down on the carrier deck, he had approximately 15 minutes of fuel remaining. 15 minutes. That was the margin between survival and becoming another statistic. Vraeshu would fly combat missions for another month before being rotated home to training duty. By war's end, his official tally was 19 confirmed kills, making him the 16th highest scoring American Navy pilot of the war. But more important than his personal score was what his achievement meant. The Hellcat had defeated the Zero so completely that shooting down 19 Japanese aircraft in a single day had become survivable. No pilot in a Wildcat had ever achieved such numbers. No pilot in a Wildcat would have come home alive. The numbers changed everything. By the end of 1944, the mathematics of air combat in the Pacific was no longer competitive. It was predetermined. From June 1944 to August 1945, American Hellcats participated in 3,682 air-to-air engagements with Japanese aircraft. During those 3,682 engagements, Hellcats accounted for approximately 5,271 confirmed kills, not counting probable kills or damaged aircraft. American Hellcat losses during the same period, for 107 aircraft. That's a kill ratio of 12.9 to 1. For context, that means for every Hellcat lost, nearly 13 enemy aircraft were destroyed. No other fighter aircraft in World War II, American, German, British, or Soviet, achieved kill ratios even close to this. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, roughly 2 to 1 against the Supermarine Spitfire. The British Spitfire against the Focke-Wulf FW-190, roughly 1.3 to 1. The German Bf-109 against Soviet fighters, approximately 4 to 1 at best. But the F6F Hellcat, nearly 3 times better than any fighter versus fighter comparison in the war. And it wasn't just numbers. The Hellcat fundamentally broke Japanese naval strategy. Stat: Japanese naval doctrine in 1941 to 1942 relied on air superiority. The assumption that Japanese pilots and aircraft would overwhelm American naval air forces in any engagement. Stat: By 1944, the Japanese Navy had suffered losses so catastrophic, over 5,000 aircraft destroyed in combat, that it lacked experienced replacement pilots. Japan's aircraft industry, despite producing aircraft, had no pilots trained well enough to fly them. America's aircraft industry had produced not just fighters, but trained pilots to fly them. Stat: The United States trained approximately 65,000 military pilots during World War II. Stat: Japan trained approximately 14,000 pilots total, and by 1945 was down to a training capacity of only a few hundred per month. Asterisk. The gap wasn't just numerical. It was cultural. American pilots who were shot down over friendly territory were recovered. They returned to combat after medical treatment. Experienced pilots accumulated more experience. Japanese pilots who were shot down fell into the ocean. They were lost. Japan's experienced pilot corps was a finite resource being spent like ammunition. By 1944, The Hellcat had accelerated Japan's pilot bleeding to catastrophic levels. Experienced Japanese pilots with 300-plus combat flying hours were practically extinct by June 1944. American pilots with 300-plus hours were increasingly common. This was the psychological victory that mattered more than any single statistic. Japanese pilots knew that they were flying an inferior aircraft, not because of propaganda, but because they'd experienced it. They'd fought Hellcats. They'd watched their friends die to Hellcats. They'd learned that turning and maneuvering, the fundamental doctrines of zero combat, were worthless against this machine. One captured Japanese pilot, interrogated after being shot down, described the Hellcat as a box that flies. Ugly, slow compared to our Zero, but it has more guns than sense. But he was lying. Not intentionally, but he was lying. The Hellcat wasn't slow. It wasn't inferior. It was simply designed for a different kind of war. The Zero was designed to outfly American pilots. The Hellcat was designed to outstrategy them. By 1945, that strategy had won. The Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific in 1942, had been erased as a combat force by 1944. Not because American pilots were braver or Japan's pilots were cowards, but because the Hellcat had changed the fundamental equation. Speed beats maneuverability. Firepower beats elegance. Armor beats sacrifice. And numbers, overwhelming numerical advantage combined with superior aircraft, beats everything else. The Hellcat had delivered that message in a language that couldn't be misunderstood. The language of fire and blood and burning aircraft falling from the sky. The F6F Hellcat never achieved the legendary status of some other World War II aircraft. The Spitfire had romance. The Mustang had mystique. The Corsair had reputation. The Hellcat had something better: results. A total of 12,275 F6F Hellcats were manufactured between 1942 and 1945. During that production run, Hellcats accounted for 5,271 aerial kills, approximately 75% of all American Navy fighter kills in the Pacific War. 3 out of every 4 Japanese aircraft shot down by American Navy fighters? Hellcats. Let that sink in. Not the sleek, sexy fighters. Not the aircraft that made pilots feel like aces. The dump truck. The boxy, armored, underpowered-looking machine that Navy pilots had mocked when they first saw it. That aircraft had ended a war. The story of the F6F Hellcat is the story of how engineering overcame expectation. How function defeated form. How an aircraft that looked inferior proved to be devastatingly, categorically superior in the only measurement that mattered. Did it kill enemy aircraft, and did its pilots come home alive? A total of 270 Hellcats were shot down by Japanese aircraft throughout the entire war, meaning the aircraft had a combat survival rate of 97.8%. Pilots flew this aircraft and lived. They flew it and survived. They flew it and won. For pilots who'd been dying in Wildcats, who'd been watching experienced comrades fall to zeros, who'd spent 2 years believing they were inferior, the Hellcat was more than just an aircraft. It was redemption. What surprised you most about the Hellcat story? Was it the raw statistics? The engineering ingenuity? Or the fact that sometimes the most important weapons don't look the part? Tell me in the comments below. If you want to learn more about forgotten heroes of World War II aviation, the pilots, the aircraft, the battles that changed history, then hit that subscribe button. We're uploading videos every Tuesday exploring the most incredible stories from the Pacific War. Next week, the Corsair's death trap reputation was a lie. Here's what really happened. You won't believe what the data actually shows about this legendary aircraft.